Orphaned at 9 years old and cast out of the only home she had left at 17, Ada Mercer stood on a splintered platform in the Kansas dust, with $2.15 sewn into the hem of her only good dress. Her uncle by marriage, a man named Corwin Tate, who had never once looked at her without counting the cost of her supper, had told her plainly that a girl who could not pay her keep had no place at his table. So she walked, and she rode when a wagon would have her, and she arrived in the little rail town of Junction Flats with nothing but her hands, her grandmother's sewing needle, and a stubborn, quiet faith that something in this world still belonged to her. What she found, sitting alone and rusting on a forgotten spur of track behind the depot, was a condemned railroad car nobody wanted, and for $2, the station master was glad to be rid of it. She did not know, as she pressed her coins into his palm, that beneath a loose board in that car's floor lay a truth 12 years buried, a truth that would clear a dead man's name, unearth a fortune meant for people who had given up hoping for it, and turn the whole town of Junction Flats inside out. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Ada Mercer. If you have ever felt like the world had written you off before you'd even had your say, tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. We'd love to know we're not so far apart after all. Ada had not always been alone. Before the fever took her mother and father within 4 days of each other, in the spring of 1878, she had lived in a low farmhouse outside a town called Willowdale, where her father kept bees and her mother kept a garden so orderly that neighbor women used to stop their wagons just to look at the rows of beans standing at attention like soldiers. Ada was 9 that spring, old enough to remember the smell of her mother's hands, which always carried a trace of lavender and yeast, and old enough to remember her father's voice reading scripture by lamplight, in a cadence so steady it made the whole house feel safe. What she carried forward from those years was not property, for there was little enough of that, but a habit of mind her mother had planted early and often, that nothing given up for lost was truly lost until someone stopped looking for it. Her mother used to say it about buttons, about hens that wandered from the coop, about a lame dog they nursed back from the edge of death one hard winter. Look again before you call a thing gone. Ada took the words the way some children take a hymn, without fully understanding them, only to find later in life that they had lodged themselves someplace deep enough to guide her. After her parents died, she went to live with her mother's sister, Beulah, a childless widow with a small dressmaking trade in Willowdale, and it was there that Ada learned the second skill that would carry her through everything to come, not sewing exactly, though she grew fast and fine at that too, but reading. Aunt Beulah kept a shelf of books that had belonged to her late husband, a school teacher, and on evenings when custom was slow, she taught Ada her letters using a Bible, a farmer's almanac, and a battered volume of Aesop's fables with half its spine gone. By the time Ada was 12, she could read anything put in front of her, fast and true, and she had also learned something that would matter more than she knew, how to look at a ledger, for Aunt Beulah kept careful books for her trade, columns of debits and credits ruled in a hand so neat it looked engraved, and she showed Ada how numbers, kept honestly, told a story just as surely as words did. "A ledger doesn't lie, child," Beulah used to say, licking the end of her pencil before totaling a column. "People lie. Numbers only repeat what's put into them." It was a lesson Ada would not fully understand the weight of for another 5 years, but she never forgot it. Those years with Aunt Beulah were not soft, exactly. There was never quite enough coal, never quite enough meat in the pot, and Ada wore her cousin's outgrown dresses taken in at the seams, but they were kind, and they were steady, and Ada came to believe that steadiness itself was a kind of wealth. She learned to mend a hem so the stitches vanished into the cloth, to launder linen white as new snow, to keep her own counsel in a house where gossip sometimes ran faster than the creek in springtime. She grew tall and plain-featured in a way she did not mind, with dark hair she wore in a braid down her back, and a steadiness in her gray eyes that made older women trust her with their secrets and younger children trust her with their fears. She might have gone on that way indefinitely, learning her aunt's trade and easing, someday, into a life of her own making, had Beulah not caught a chill in the winter of 1885 that settled into her lungs and refused to leave. Beulah died in February of that year, and with her died the only real safety Ada had known since childhood. The little house and the dressmaking trade passed, by a will nobody had thought to update in a decade, to Beulah's husband's nephew, a distant, grasping man named Corwin Tate, who arrived from 3 counties over within a week of the funeral to take inventory of what he now considered his. Corwin Tate looked at 17-year-old Ada the way a man looks at an old coat he's trying to decide whether to keep or give away, and he decided, within a fortnight, that a niece by marriage, with no blood claim on him and no dowry to speak of, was more burden than she was worth. He did not put her out cruelly, not exactly. He simply informed her, over a supper he had begun rationing thinner each week, that he could not be expected to feed a grown woman who brought nothing to his household, and that she would do well to find work, or a husband, or somewhere else to be, by the 1st of the month. Ada did not argue. She had learned young that arguing with men like Corwin Tate only sharpened their resolve. She packed what little she owned into a single carpet bag: Beulah's sewing needle, a spool of good thread, 3 dresses, and the Aesop's fables with the broken spine. And she left Willowdale on a westbound freight wagon with $2.15 to her name, sewn carefully into the hem of her skirt, where a careless hand would not find it. She traveled for the better part of 6 weeks, working where she could. A week of laundering for a boarding house in one town, 3 days of mending harness leather for a farmer's wife in another, once a whole month keeping house for an elderly doctor's widow, who paid her almost nothing but taught her, in passing, how to set a bone and dress a wound, knowledge Ada tucked away the way she tucked away everything, not knowing yet what use it might serve. By the time she reached Junction Flats, a rail town of perhaps 1,100 souls sitting where a spur line met the main trunk of the Kansas Pacific, it was late autumn of 1885, and Ada Mercer had precisely the same $2.15 she had left Willowdale with, because she had made herself a promise, somewhere on that long road, that she would not spend the last of what she had until she found a place to plant herself. She did not yet know that Junction Flats would be that place. She only knew that the wagon she had ridden in on had no further use for a passenger without fare for the next leg, and so she climbed down into the mud of the depot yard as the sun was setting, cold, hungry, and entirely without prospects. It was there, walking the length of the rail yard looking for anywhere dry to spend the night, that she first saw the car. It sat alone on a spur of track that had not seen a locomotive in years, half swallowed by prairie grass gone to seed, its once red paint scoured to gray by a decade of Kansas wind. It was not a passenger car, and not quite a freight car either, smaller than both, with a single door on its side and 2 narrow windows, the kind of specialized car railroads sometimes built for a particular purpose and then abandoned once that purpose passed. Its wheels had sunk half into the earth, and a scrub of sunflowers had rooted themselves boldly along its northern side, as if the prairie had already begun the slow work of reclaiming it. A hand-lettered sign nailed to the depot fence read, in fading paint, "Condemned, not for use," and beneath it, in a newer hand, "For sale, inquire within." Ada inquired within. The station master, a heavy-set, weary man named Otis Fenwick, who had held his post at Junction Flats longer than most of the town's buildings had stood, looked up from his ledger with the particular expression of a man who had been trying to get rid of a nuisance for years and could hardly believe his luck. The car, he explained, had belonged to the railroad company itself, some kind of special-purpose car built back in the early 70s, but it had been sitting condemned and unused since 1874, and the company had long since written it off their books and left it to Junction Flats to dispose of as the town saw fit, provided nobody sued the railroad over it. Nobody in 11 years had wanted it. It had no engine, no wheels fit for travel, nothing inside but dust and mouse nests, so far as anyone had bothered to look. He'd take $2 for it, and count himself lucky to have it off the yard before the county came asking why an eyesore was sitting on railroad land, collecting nothing but sunflowers. Ada looked at the car a long moment. She thought of her mother's voice, "Look again before you call a thing gone," and she thought, too, in a more practical vein, that a car with 4 solid walls and a roof, however rusted, was more shelter than she currently possessed, and that $2 was a price she could bear to pay for a roof over her head through the coming winter, even if the town thought her a fool for it. Otis Fenwick certainly seemed to think so. He pocketed her $2 with a look somewhere between pity and relief, muttering that she'd want to check it for rattlesnakes before she made her bed in it, and that was the whole of the transaction. Ada Mercer, orphaned, penniless, and 17 years past her mother's death, became the owner of Junction Flats' most notorious eyesore, and she carried her carpetbag through its narrow door as the last light went out of the sky, entirely unaware that she had just purchased the answer to a mystery that had haunted the town for over a decade. The inside of the car, once her eyes adjusted to the dimness, was not the ruin she'd expected. Someone, long ago, had fitted it out with more care than a common freight car. There were the remains of a built-in desk along one wall, a narrow iron stove bolted to the floor near the door, and shelving that had once held ledgers or account books, most of it now home to mice and dust, and a colony of paper wasps that had abandoned their nest sometime in seasons past. It had, she realized as she swept the worst of the debris toward the door with a broom fashioned from sunflower stalks, clearly been some kind of office car, a paymaster's car perhaps, or a surveyor's, built to travel the line and conduct company business from wherever the rails happened to end. She spent her first night there wrapped in her one blanket, listening to the wind work through gaps in the siding, and told herself, with more resolve than confidence, that she had chosen well. It was on her 3rd day of cleaning, as she pried up a section of the plank flooring that had buckled and warped near the old built-in desk, meaning only to nail it back flat before the winter frost worked it looser still, that she found the board was not warped at all, but cut deliberately, fitted with small brass tabs along its underside that let it lift free of the floor joists like a lid, concealing a shallow compartment beneath. Her heart went up into her throat as she lifted it clear. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth gone brittle and yellow with age, she found a leather-bound ledger, a bundle of letters tied with a ribbon that had once been blue, and a small tin box, rusted at its seams, that rattled faintly when she lifted it. She did not open the tin box that first evening. She sat on the floor of the car with the ledger open across her knees, reading by the last gray light through the narrow window, and by the time full dark forced her to stop, she understood that she had stumbled into something far larger than a lost curiosity, and far more dangerous than a stranger in a new town ought to go poking at alone. The ledger belonged, its first pages made clear, to a man named Silas Vane, and it was dated from 1873 and 1874. A paymaster's ledger, recording wages dispersed along the spur line, then being built out from Junction Flats, and land grant filings for the settlers whose claims lay along the proposed right-of-way. Ada knew a little of the history already, the way anyone in a rail town absorbed it from overheard talk, that the Junction Flats spur had been built with promises to local homesteaders that their land claims, filed and pending along the surveyed route, would be honored and paid out fairly by the railroad company once the line went through, in exchange for rights of passage across the edges of their acreage. And she knew, too, the other half of that old story, the half spoken in lower voices, that in the autumn of 1874, the company's paymaster, Silas Vane, had vanished from Junction Flats in the same week that some $40,000 in payroll and land settlement funds went missing from the company's accounts, and that Vane had never been seen again, and had been condemned in absentia as a thief and an embezzler by everyone from the railroad superintendent down to the town's own newspaper. His name, she would learn in the days that followed, was still spoken in Junction Flats with a curl of the lip, a shorthand for betrayal, and there was a family, a widow, long since remarried under another name, and a grown daughter who had left the county rather than carry the shame of it, who had suffered the whole weight of that judgment for 11 years. But the ledger in Ada's lap told a very different story than the one the town had settled into believing, and it told it in the plainest possible language: numbers. Silas Vane, it seemed, had not been careless with money nor greedy for it. In the months before his disappearance, his entries grew increasingly careful, increasingly precise, as though he sensed he was building not just an account, but a case. He had begun, sometime in the summer of 1874, cross-referencing the land claims filed by local settlers against the actual acreage the railroad surveyors were purchasing outright from a company called the Prairie Development Consortium, a company Ada had never heard of, but which the ledger made clear was buying up, at rock-bottom prices, precisely the parcels the settlers believed were merely being crossed by rail, not sold out from under them. And the ledger showed, in Vane's own careful hand, that the man authorizing those purchases, the man who controlled both the settlement funds meant for the homesteaders and the shadow company quietly buying their land, was the railroad's regional superintendent, a man named Augustus Pratt. Ada read late into that first night and much of the next, and what emerged from Vane's careful entries, cross-checked against the bundle of letters, most of them drafts, never sent, addressed to the railroad's head office in Topeka, was the shape of a man who had discovered a fraud being committed against the very settlers he was meant to be paying, and who had spent his final weeks trying, cautiously and at great personal risk, to gather proof of it before he brought the matter forward. One letter, dated only 4 days before his disappearance, spoke of his fear that Pratt had grown suspicious of his inquiries, and of his intention to travel to Topeka himself rather than trust the matter to the mail. He never made that journey, so far as history recorded. He vanished instead, and Augustus Pratt, still very much alive and now the most powerful man in 3 counties, the founder of the very bank that held half of Junction Flats' mortgages, had spent 11 years as a pillar of the community he had quietly robbed. The tin box, when Ada finally worked its rusted lid free 2 evenings later, held not treasure in any romantic sense, but something almost more startling in its plainness. A stack of paper currency, old-issue notes totaling just over $4,000, along with a folded map marking the original settler claims, and a short accounting, in Vane's hand, of exactly which families were owed what, drawn from the settlement fund he had apparently managed to protect from Pratt's reach before he vanished. Money he had hidden, rather than let it be swallowed into the same scheme he'd uncovered. Money meant to be restored to its rightful owners the moment he could prove his case. He had never gotten the chance, and so it had sat 40 feet from the Junction Flats depot for 11 years, while a good man's name rotted under a false charge, and the families he'd tried to protect went on believing the railroad had simply never honored promises no one could any longer prove had been made. Ada understood, sitting alone in that car with the truth spread across her lap, that she now held something that could either be buried again forever or could tear open a wound the whole town had long since scarred over, and that whichever she chose, it would not be a quiet choice. She was, after all, nobody in Junction Flats, an orphaned stranger with $2 worth of standing and a dead man's ledger for her only proof. Augustus Pratt was a bank president, a church deacon, a man whose name graced the cornerstone of the new schoolhouse. She thought of her mother's words again that night, "Look again before you call a thing gone," and understood them, finally, in their fullest and heaviest sense. This was not lost buttons or a wandering hen. This was a man's stolen name and a town's stolen trust, and someone had to look again on their behalf. She moved cautiously at first, not from timidity but from the plain arithmetic of her position. She spent the better part of a week making her car livable and unremarkable, patching its siding, mending its door, letting the town's curiosity about the odd new girl in the depot's eyesore settle into the ordinary rhythm of small-town gossip rather than suspicion. She took in mending, as she'd learned to do from Aunt Beulah, and word of her careful, honest stitching spread quickly enough that she was soon earning a small, steady trickle of coin. But quietly in the evenings, she copied Vane's ledger entries into a fresh notebook in her own hand, cross-referenced the old land claim map against the current county plat book she was permitted to study at the land office under the pretense of settling her own small claim to the depot lot, and began, one careful thread at a time, to understand exactly how thoroughly Augustus Pratt had woven himself into the fabric of Junction Flats in the years since Silas Vane's disappearance. She found her first ally in Otis Fenwick himself, the station master who had sold her the car and clearly regretted underestimating what it contained the moment she worked up the nerve to show him a portion of what she'd found. Otis had been a young dispatcher back in 1874, and he remembered Silas Vane not as the town's memory painted him, but as a careful, courteous, worried man in his final weeks. He even recalled, once Ada's questions jogged the memory loose, that Vane had asked him, days before he vanished, whether the eastbound mail could be trusted to reach Topeka safely, a question that had meant nothing to Otis at the time and meant a great deal now. Otis was no crusader, and he made it plain he wanted no trouble with a man as powerful as Pratt, but he agreed, at least, to keep her confidence, and that alone was worth more to Ada than gold. Her second ally came by accident, when she went looking for the Vane family and learned that Silas's daughter, a woman named Cora Vane Ashby, had married and settled not 3 counties distant, close enough that Ada could reach her by a day's wagon ride. Cora was 31 years old when Ada found her, tired-eyed and guarded, the mother of 2 young children, and she had spent half her life hearing her father called a thief in rooms where she was expected to say nothing. When Ada laid the ledger and the letters before her on a kitchen table smelling of fresh bread, Cora Ashby wept in a way that told Ada more clearly than any words could have that this was not the reaction of a woman protecting a guilty secret, but of a woman finally, impossibly, being handed back something she had given up hope of ever recovering, her father's good name. It was Cora, in fact, who supplied the piece Ada had been missing, a final letter from Silas Vane to her mother, kept for 11 years in a trunk and never shown to anyone outside the family, in which he wrote plainly of his fear of Augustus Pratt and his intention, should anything happen to him, that the truth be found, beneath the board where a man keeps what he cannot yet prove. Cora had always believed the line to be a metaphor, a dying man's poetry. Ada now understood it had been an instruction, meant for exactly the kind of patient searcher who would one day pry up a warped plank and refuse to look away from what lay beneath it. Word of Ada's inquiries could not stay quiet forever, not in a town the size of Junction Flats, and it reached Augustus Pratt sooner than Ada would have liked. Carried, she suspected, by a land office clerk eager to curry favor with the man who held his mortgage. Pratt came to her himself on a gray afternoon in early December, arriving at the depot yard in a fine black coat entirely unsuited to the mud, and he was, at first, all courtesy. A concerned citizen, he said, troubled to hear that a young newcomer was stirring up old, painful history that could only hurt the very families she claimed to want to help. He offered, with the smooth confidence of a man used to having his offers accepted, to purchase the car from her outright, sight unseen, for the considerable sum of $200, no questions asked, a fortune to a girl who had arrived in town with $2.15. When Ada declined, gently but plainly, his courtesy thinned quickly into something colder. He reminded her, in tones just short of a threat, that a young woman alone, with no family and no standing in Junction Flats, would do well to consider how quickly a town's goodwill could turn, and how easily a bank could call in the note on a business that depended on its neighbor's trust. Ada was frightened. She would tell the truth of that to anyone who asked, in later years, rather than pretend to a courage she hadn't fully possessed. But she was not moved, because she understood something Pratt, in his 11 years of unchallenged comfort, had forgotten, that a ledger kept honestly does not care whose feelings it disturbs, and that she was no longer merely defending a dead man's memory, but carrying, in her own 2 hands, the unpaid debts of a dozen families who had every right to know what had been taken from them. She spent the following weeks working as quietly and carefully as a woman assembling a court case, with no lawyer and no standing to bring one, because in truth, that was very nearly what she was doing. She located 3 of the original homesteading families named in Vane's map, all of them still farming the same land, all of them still nursing a quiet, unspoken grievance against a railroad settlement that had somehow never fully materialized. And she showed them, with Cora Ashby now standing beside her as living proof the matter was no idle rumor, precisely how their claims had been quietly folded into the Prairie Development Consortium's holdings, while the town believed the railroad's promises had simply lapsed with time. It was old Reverend Whitcomb, pastor of the Junction Flats Methodist congregation, and a man who had baptized half the town, including, uncomfortably, 2 of Augustus Pratt's grandchildren, who finally gave Ada the platform she needed, agreeing to let her lay the whole matter before a gathering at the church hall on a Sunday evening in mid-December, provided she could show real evidence and not merely accusation. Word spread through Junction Flats that week the way fire spreads through dry grass, and by the appointed evening, the hall was fuller than it had been for anything short of a funeral or a wedding. Farmers and shopkeepers and the school teacher and Otis Fenwick all crowded onto hard pews to hear what the strange girl from the railroad car had to say. Ada spoke plainly, because plainness was the only weapon she trusted herself to wield well. She laid Silas Vane's ledger open on the pulpit stand and walked the room, family by family, through the numbers. The acreage the settlers believed they still owned, against the acreage quietly transferred to the Prairie Development Consortium, the settlement payments the railroad's own books showed as disbursed against the far smaller sums the families had actually received, and the plain, damning fact that the Prairie Development Consortium's Articles of Incorporation, which Cora Ashby's husband, a county clerk in his own right, had located and brought that very evening, listed Augustus Pratt among its founding shareholders under a name close enough to his own that no honest search could call it coincidence. Pratt, present in the hall and growing paler by the minute, tried at first to dismiss the whole matter as the fevered imaginings of a homeless girl chasing an old scandal for attention, but the numbers did not care for his indignation, and neither, increasingly, did the room. Cora Ashby stood and spoke of her father's true character, of the letter that had waited 11 years in a trunk, and by the time Ada finished, laying the small tin box itself upon the pulpit and announcing that its $4,000 would be returned in full, with her help, to the families it had always belonged to, the silence in the hall had the particular, ringing quality of a town's understanding of itself quietly and permanently rearranging. Augustus Pratt did not go to prison. The fraud was 11 years old, the paper trail imperfect, and Ada had never wanted vengeance so much as restoration, but he did not survive Junction Flats' revised opinion of him either. His bank's board, several of whose members had land claims of their own tangled in the old settlement, demanded his resignation within the month, and he removed himself quietly to Topeka before winter's end, his name struck from the schoolhouse cornerstone the following spring by a town council eager to be rid of the association. Silas Vane, meanwhile, was formally cleared by the railroad's own head office once Ada's ledger and letters reached Topeka through channels Reverend Whitcomb himself helped arrange, and a modest but genuine notice ran in the Junction Flats paper, correcting the record of a man who had died, or vanished, trying to do right by his neighbors. The recovered $4,000, distributed among the families whose claims had been quietly stolen, restored to several of them the difference between a hard winter and a bearable one, and Ada, true to the instinct that had guided her from the start, took not 1 cent of it for herself, though the grateful families and Cora Ashby together insisted she accept a small sum in gratitude, enough that the girl who had arrived in Junction Flats with $2.15 now had, for the first time in her life, a modest cushion against hard weather. She used part of it, fittingly, to make proper repairs to the railroad car itself, and the town, in a gesture that surprised her more than almost anything else that winter, voted to let the spur of track and the small plot around it belong formally to her, no longer condemned but named, by unofficial and affectionate town consensus, Vane's Rest, a place where the ledger and letters were eventually put on quiet display for anyone who cared to remember how close the truth had come to staying buried. We began this story by telling you of a girl, orphaned young and cast out again at 17, who paid $2 for a railroad car nobody else wanted, and who found beneath a single loose board a truth that would clear a dead man's name and return a stolen fortune to the families who had earned it. That girl was Ada Mercer, and what made her remarkable was never luck, though luck played its small part, but the plain, patient habit her mother had planted in her as a child, that nothing given up for lost is truly lost until someone stops looking for it. She looked again at a car everyone else had written off, and in looking, she restored not only a fortune but a name, a family's dignity, and a town's understanding of its own history. She never sought to be a hero of Junction Flats, and for years afterward, she would deflect the town's gratitude with the same quiet steadiness that had carried her through every hard mile before she ever saw the place. But the families who received back what was rightfully theirs, and the daughter who finally got to bury her father's memory with honor instead of shame, knew exactly what they owed to a girl who had once had nothing but $2 and a mother's old lesson, and chose, even then, to look again. Thank you for spending this time with Ada Mercer's story, and with us. If it moved you, we hope you'll share it with someone who might need reminding that value often hides in the places the world has already given up on. Before you go, we'd love to hear from you in the comments. What is a time in your own life when you found real worth in something, or someone, that everyone else had written off? We read every story you send us, and we're grateful, always, for the time you give this quiet corner of the internet. Until next time, stay close.